Hi there, it's Dr. Christina Chen. Today, in addition to our regular episode, we'll also have a guest episode on our feed highlighting another one of Mayo Clinic's podcasts, Mayo Clinic Talks. And I was lucky enough to be a guest on this episode, which talks all about Alzheimer's disease and how it can impact family dynamics. And we figured our Aging Forward listeners might be interested too. So please listen and enjoy.
This is Mayo Clinic Talks, a curated weekly podcast for physicians and other healthcare providers. I'm your host, Daryl Chutka, a general internist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Alzheimer's disease affects not only the patient, but also has a significant impact on that patient's family. The family becomes stressed as emotional and physical burdens develop. The role of the primary care clinician in managing a patient with Alzheimer's is not only to care for the patient, but also to help and support families as they go through a very complex emotional journey. Today's podcast will cover the changes in family dynamics which commonly occur in Alzheimer's disease, including caregiver burden, legal decisions which need to be made, and sometimes difficult ethical choices which will be made as the disease progresses. So what are some common sources of conflict within families as they care for their loved one with Alzheimer's? What can we do as a clinician to help families through this difficult journey? How do we approach a situation where there's disagreement in the family regarding management? These are some of the questions I'll be asking my guest, Dr. Christina Chen, an internist and geriatrician in the Division of Community Internal Medicine at the Mayo Clinic, as we discuss Alzheimer's disease and family dynamics. You're listening to Mayo Clinic Talks. Christina, I am so glad to have you as my guest today. I've been looking forward to this for some time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Chutka. It's always a pleasure to be on your podcasts.
Let's talk about some of the emotional responses that we see from family members when we give the patient and the family a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, and first I just want to say I'm really glad we're dedicating a talk not just on the disease process itself, but who it influences, right? Like you alluded to, Alzheimer's ripples through the entire relationship experience, redefining roles in daily life. And so I think we have to think about the family system and the care circle as the disease transforms the journey for everyone involved. And so as far as emotional responses, the best way I can explain it is probably an emotional roller coaster. It's different for every person. At first, with the initial diagnosis, I often see a sense of shock or disbelief. It can be very hard to accept that what was simple memory lapses is now part of a larger diagnosis. For others, denial is very common, as a knee-jerk reaction, and it may be more of a temporary way to cope, but these differences in emotions often lead to what can cause the initial troubles accepting the diagnosis and causing the frictions between family members. And then as the diagnosis sinks in, especially as things are not getting better, I see a lot of sadness and grief that follows. And it's not the kind of grief that comes after death, but more of a painful awareness that your loved one is physically here, but they're kind of changing slowly in ways that feels like you're losing them piece by piece. So I often hear people describe it as a long, painful goodbye. They're there, but they're not really there, as they're slowly losing them piece by piece, their identity. And so it's a very mix of emotion, I'd say. Alongside grief, there's also a lot of fear and anxiety, fear of what the future holds, anxiety from caregivers about how to manage the growing demands of caregiving. There's often a lot of anger and frustration too, which is, I think, more during the day-to-day caregiving process, whether it's directed at the disease itself or perhaps at the person living with the disease. Imagine trying to care for someone who's resisting your cares or behaving in a way that's not very easy to manage, So, and then lastly, I think universally, guilt can be a very powerful theme. Guilt largely over just not doing enough. What can I be doing more of? This sense of helplessness. And then especially when they're considering long-term care or memory care, it can be a very helpless situation. So again, the roller coaster of emotion, it can cause a lot of tension and disagreements and conflict. But I think most importantly, the story doesn't end with struggle. Over time, I do see that people can work towards a sense of acceptance and even resilience. I do see a lot of great outcomes with families who are more interconnected, even in a journey of pain. They can learn from each other through shared education and shared ideas, coping strategies to help strengthen those bonds. So the emotional journey is undeniably difficult, but it can also be a very incredibly revealing experience of the depth of commitment and love amongst families.
So, something you said, I want to make a comment about. You said denial, and I've seen that so often.
Yeah,
I would say more often than not, when I give a patient and their family a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, I'd say the family takes it harder than the patient, who often doesn't accept that diagnosis. And I've never really figured out, is it denial, or don't they truly believe they have a problem? But very often they don't accept it right away. And I'm not sure exactly why, but it's a common phenomenon.
it's interesting. I've noticed that too. And I think by the time someone is diagnosed, they may have been living with this for months to years, a very slow progression. So the patient themselves, they still feel like they're living in their own
Hmm.
adaptive world and nothing seems wrong with them. And so when families all of a sudden feel like maybe a normal aging process of memory loss is all of a sudden attached to a diagnosis that often leads to a terrible outcome, it's very hard for them to make that shift from,
Yep.
oh, this is just a normal memory issue, to now they've got a disease that often is now attached to their identity. And I think that's very hard for families.
Well, when we give a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, we kind of inherit a group, not just the patient, but their family. So, can you discuss the importance of taking care of that family or a family member who's going to be caring for their patient, they're caring for their loved one with Alzheimer's?
I think caring for a person with Alzheimer's disease is often described as a 24/7 job, right? It takes tremendous emotional and physical and financial toll on families. And so the well-being of the caregiver is just as important as the well-being of the patient, because when caregivers are exhausted and stressed and isolated, they both suffer, not just one. So when you support the caregivers with the things that they need, whether it's respite or counseling or education, it protects their health and it strengthens their ability to provide the compassionate and sustainable care that their loved ones needs. And so, in short, by taking care of the family, we're also taking care of the patient.
Right. There was a popular book that came out, I don't know, maybe a decade or so ago, that reflects the type of care that's going to be needed. And I think it was called the 36-hour day,
Yes,
which is very accurate.
yes, that is probably one of my go-to resources for caregivers who are looking for things to help. So 36-hour day is it's exactly as it describes. It's not just the 24 hours that we live, but we're all constantly thinking about what else to do, how else can we support our loved ones, and it's just an ongoing thing behind your thought process that you just never sleep. Caregivers never sleep.
So true, so true. Well, how can we as clinicians assess caregiver stress as they come in with their loved one?
That's a really good question. I think as a geriatrician, I automatically do it with my visits when a patient comes in with a family. It's like, okay, there's two patients here, But I think it's so important to routinely build that into your visit to check on caregivers during their visits, and it can be pretty obvious when they're stressed. And so I think just asking simple, open-ended questions like, "How are you managing day to day?" Or "What part of caregiving feels the hardest right now?" These questions can really validate their experience and open the door to more conversations about the stress that they may be going through. There may be signs of fatigue or irritability or withdrawal. My visits are often filled with tears. They're crying, and then I'm crying, and the patient's like, "What's going on?" So they're all crying. So we're all in a very emotionally vulnerable situation because it's a very emotionally charged journey, often mixed with a combination of frustration and sadness and guilt. But the bottom line is that assessing caregiver stress should be a routine part of dementia care. And by recognizing the caregiver as a second patient it helps clinicians better ensure that the person with Alzheimer's and their support partner is healthier and better equipped to manage this long journey.
Yeah. Well, those with Alzheimer's disease want to remain home, yet they really need their family member to allow that to happen. And if you lose that family member, they have had it. We're talking long-term care. So it is important to take care of the family member as well as the patient. So what are some things we can do to help relieve the stress on the caregivers?
So I think it's first recognizing what they are struggling with and what are some of the resources that they need. And there's a lot of resources in the community. Most people don't recognize how much there is out there. So I always give them some resources to consider. There's usually 5 layers of resources. So I ask them, what are you struggling with? Whether is it home support services? Do we need help with prep or grocery delivery or housekeeping? Sometimes just taking a little bit of load off can make a big difference. And then a step beyond that are things like home health and personal care aides. Just the act of giving a bath can be very stressful, And so understanding where you're able to handle and where we can offload some other tasks for other people who can help out as well. And sometimes just having more bodies in the home can relieve the caregiver burden. And then I always recommend for caregivers to consider at least one day a week of some type of respite care, whether it's through adult day programs or perhaps longer respite services, or just finding ways to give them a break. Because when you're in this caregiving role every single day for months and years, you often don't realize how much is eating away at you. And then eventually, when you're burned out and stressed and anxious, and depressed, clinically depressed, that's kind of too late. And then backtracking, it's easier to get things handled proactively than to catastrophically fix things when it's too late. At an individual level, there's many support groups and counseling peer groups. There's the Alzheimer's Association and other community programs where there are so many caregivers out there handling this on their own, and they don't have to do that alone. There is a community support group. We just have to find them and understand that we can walk through this journey together with other people who are going through the same thing.
Yeah. Is there anything we can do as a primary care clinician regarding the patient's program, medical care that would make life easier for the family?
Yeah, as primary care clinicians, I think the most meaningful thing that we can offer families is that sense of partnership. And simply that partnership gives caregivers a tremendous sense of relief, knowing that their medical team is walking alongside them and helping them navigate each stage. So whether that's through regular check-ins, whether it's through telemedicine visits, all that can be very valuable in assessing where the patient is, not just in the disease process, but identifying new challenges, connecting families with resources that's appropriate for that time, and just trying to ease the burden of whatever they're going through. Sometimes simplifying their medications can make a big difference too. I often tell families that there's always something we can do. We're never at the end of the line. There's always something we can do to improve quality of life. So it's like, okay, today, what issues are you having today? Let's think of a solution together. The goal is to face those challenges together as a team. And it's that sense of collaboration that makes the medical care stronger, but it also helps reassure families that they're not alone in this journey.
It is a frightening journey. It's a frightening journey for the family, and establishing a sense of partnership with them, I think, really helps, that they're not alone, that you're going to walk this journey with them.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the family itself. What are some common sources of conflicts within the families as they deal with Alzheimer's disease? Because there are some.
Yeah, there's a lot. I've seen all types of conflict. And it's not because they don't care, but like I mentioned earlier, this is such an emotionally charged journey, and everyone has a different emotional response, right? So the most common source of tension, I think, is different levels of acceptance, where some people may acknowledge the diagnosis, adapt very quickly, while others remain perhaps more in denial or they're more fearful, and so they minimize symptoms. And all of these differences can lead to clashes about how care should be managed. and what should be done, especially during the early disease process. But then another source of conflict is the division of caregiving responsibilities. And I have observed that in many families, especially larger families, there's always that one person, whether it's a spouse or an adult child, who takes on the bulk of caregiving. And everyone else, they're perfectly involved, but they're not as involved. And I don't know why it just naturally sort of evolves that way, and this imbalance, I think, over the long run can really create resentment or arguments about who's doing enough, and a lot of like blame shifting. Financial decisions can be challenging because, these are big decisions about how do we sell the home, who's going to keep the money, and all these can amplify tensions. And then I'd say finally, the decisions about the patient's care plan, big choices about when to stop driving, who's going to be the bad guy and take, dad's keys away.
Yep.
When do we consider memory care? Is it unethical to put mom or dad in memory care? These are, again, all very emotionally charged decisions. And so people may deal with these conflicts based on their own opinions or their relationship with the person, their own coping style. And it's these disagreements that can really strain relationships at a time when unity and support are the most needed. What I just want to end by saying, I think at the heart of these conflicts is overwhelmingly love and concern. But because emotions run high, families often just need that guidance and reassurance to help navigate these decisions together.
I think we could spend an entire podcast on how we approach families in making these difficult decisions, especially, having them stop driving, or
Yeah.
when it's time to move to a more formal assisted living facility or a skilled care. Those are tough decisions, and it really needs to be done tactfully and with care, as you mentioned.
Yes. Yeah. I think conversations work the best when they're grounded in compassion and love rather than conflict.
Exactly.
And so there's always a bad guy or a good guy, at the end of the day. And that's why I think having those decisions made earlier on, as early as possible through advanced care planning, can relieve some of those burdens because it's the person telling you what they want before we have to make that decision later on
Yeah.
down the road.
Another important decision that should be made is determining power of attorney for healthcare, advanced directives. When do you recommend those discussions start?
Short answer is as early as possible. Ideally, soon after a diagnosis, while the person with Alzheimer's is still able to make decisions and express their wishes. And again, these decisions are not about giving up control, but it's more about ensuring the individual's values and their preferences and their voice, now when it's still of sound mind, can guide their care even as the disease progresses. So early planning really reduces that family conflict. It prevents crisis-driven decisions and provides a peace of mind for both the person and their loved ones, knowing that their choices today will reflect what mattered most to them down the line.
Yeah, it's so important for us to know what the patient wants rather than what the spouse or the daughter or the son thinks their family member wants. So I agree, as early as possible while the patient is still able to make some meaningful contribution to what they want for the future. Well, let's talk a little bit about when family members disagree. Often this is centered around the degree of aggressiveness of care, and at least in my experience, the family member who lives the furthest away is maybe the least realistic. Do everything you can for mom. Don't if you can keep her alive. CPR, ventilation, whatever you need. Whereas a family member who has been nearby, visits frequently, can see what's happening, it seems like they're more realistic in terms of what they want for the future.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
And it's a very tough situation, and there isn't always one right answer. And like you said, it depends on the person and their disease, where they are with the disease. So for example, in earlier stages of Alzheimer's, if there is a reversible problem like a infection that could be treated and allow them to return into a fairly good quality of life, then pursuing treatment a little bit more aggressively can make sense, if they can return back to that quality of life at baseline. I think where things become more complicated is in the moderate to advanced stages where function is worse and cognition is worse and long-term prognosis doesn't look great. At that point, I think a major health event like a stroke or severe infection may result in a very low chance of meaningful recovery or quality of life. And that's where the role of the medical team becomes very critical. To be just very honest and transparent about what the likely outcomes are and guide families in weighing in whether interventions will truly add quality or only prolong suffering. And so the hardest decision I come across is, the request of fluids or tube feeding when someone with Alzheimer's is in their kind of last stages and they're not eating, they're not drinking, they're kind of failing to thrive. And without understanding the medical background of adding these interventions are not only invasive, but they can actually create more problems like aspiration pneumonia and create more risks and physical burden. These are not conversations that are routinely, discussed. And so having these conversations about not just how much longer someone lives, but how well they can live, I think helps shift the focus from that quantity of life to quality of life. And that helps families come together about decisions that really honor that person's dignity and value. But the medical team has to be at the center of that to really bring in the prognostic discussion, or else people can think my mom can live for another 5, 10 years, and that simply may not be true.
Well, I haven't worked in long-term care for quite a while now, but when I did do long-term care and I sensed there was disagreement in the family, I would go through various scenarios that would likely, come up. What about hospitalization? What about intubation, ventilation, antibiotics, CPR? And I would ask the families to discuss these issues and come to a consensus early rather than on a Saturday or Sunday night, which when all of these problems seem to come to fruition. And then I'd also ask for a spokesperson for the family.
Mm-hmm.
Who can I talk to when I need to, who speaks for the family, rather than to have to call 14, different relatives discussing what mom wants.
Yeah, and that's so true. I think having a framework to start by setting the stage of let's start with our shared values here. What can we all agree on? We all agree on the fact that we want the best for our loved one. No one's intentionally trying to make the bad decision or be the evil person here, right? And to your point, gathering information and understanding each person's perspectives can be so helpful because perhaps the daughter in California doesn't know what's going on and they just need
Right.
just a comprehensive understanding of here's where we're at. And then outlining scenarios of, it's not just one decision. There's multitude of things we can choose from. What can we then identify as common ground to reframe the decision ultimately as something that can be valuable for your loved one? And the focus is what is being gained, not what's being lost. Is gaining safety or peace of mind or the ability to spend more meaningful time together without worry. What can we gain from this decision that we will all make together now that we have common ground and that the decision is made, again, on compassion rather than conflict?
Well, when you see a fair amount of dysfunction within the family, do you ever recommend family counseling or therapy? Would that be of any benefit in managing the stress that they're going through?
Absolutely. I think we all need a little bit of therapy in many ways. And I've seen so many caregivers develop clinically significant depression and anxiety. The brain just can't turn off physically and emotionally, you just can't turn off because they're always on the go and they often are doing this on their own. So therapy provides a very safe space for them to recognize these emotions while also helping families communicate more effectively with each other in healthier ways. And so there is individual therapy, but there's also family therapy, there's caregiver support groups, there's cognitive behavioral therapy specifically for caregivers on how to cope, how to learn acceptance-based approaches, how to reframe our thinking so that we don't feel overwhelmed. For example, a common coping skill could be whenever they're feeling overwhelmed, instead of leading to that negative emotion, reframe a thought, I can't handle this. This is too much. but just taking a pause, a couple deep breaths, and then reframing it to think, okay, this moment is hard, but I have done this before. I've gotten through difficult days before, and I can do this. So it's just different ways of reframing our perspective so that we can make this journey more resilient and turning things that are negative into something more positive. I actually have an example that I'm going through right now. My mom's been very sick and she doesn't have Alzheimer's disease, but her disease has impacted her memory a lot to the point where she is asking the same question 10, 20 times a day, which normally would really test my patience, right?
Right.
But I have learned to turn it into more of a reminiscence of whenever she asks the same question, again, the 10th time, I think to myself, boy, when I was a kid, I bet she had to listen to the questions that I asked over and over, when I was a toddler. And she always listened and answered in patience. And so I'm bringing gratitude into what once was a frustrating experience and turning it into a memory of like how wonderful of a mom she was when she cared for me. And now I have the honor of taking care of her. So it's really changed my way of caring for my loved one.
That's a beautiful approach. Well, Christina, you're in the front lines of all of this. What do you see is the most significant unmet need for our healthcare system in providing support or lack of support for family members as they cope with Alzheimer's?
One of the most significant unmet needs is our healthcare system still lacks a standardized support structure for families caring with not just Alzheimer's disease, but all dementias. In most places, they don't have dedicated care navigators to help families connect with resources or manage the emotional toll or guide them through the complexities of the disease. The system isn't designed to incentivize caregiver support. So a lot of the burden falls on families to figure it out themselves. So I think looking forward, I would love to see a shift in how we design our system so that caregiver support is routinely integrated into mainstream practice so that it's part of the process of bringing in, whether it's the technology in place or designing the space or creating a care model where patients and families feel supported every step of the way and not just in pieces. Right now, caregivers are sort of recognized as an afterthought, but not as an essential part of the care team. So I think we really need to reframe that structure to support caregivers more in mainstream practice.
Well, Christina, we have covered a lot of ground. Can you give, oh man, I can't believe how much we got through here. Can you give maybe two or three key statements that maybe summarize our discussion?
Yeah, I thought maybe it would be interesting to kind of close with a thought exercise for our listeners, because the reality is that there's no cure. To be honest, I don't think there ever will be, at least anytime soon. And most of us are going to be caregivers to a loved one with dementia someday. So the question becomes, how do you want to be remembered as a family care partner for your loved one? And how do you want to honor your loved one until their very last day? Because I think I can summarize this all we want, but it really is about the individual person. It's not about defeating Alzheimer's, but it's about how we choose to walk alongside each other and shifting the narrative away from fear, but more towards appreciating the person behind the disease, really honoring their story, the humanity, and the life that we share together as people. And so, how can we reframe this journey as not one of loss, but as an opportunity to serve? So, the question I want to kind of leave our listeners is, how can we turn a hopeless situation into a more hopeful one? Because there's different ways of doing it. There's no right or wrong way. And so I think we have to work together to truly find that meaning and connection and hope. And I'll just leave that as kind of our podcast afterthought.
We've been discussing Alzheimer's disease and family dynamics with geriatrician Dr. Christina Chen from the Mayo Clinic. Christina, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today and some of your most beautiful comments. It was wonderful.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You can now listen to several hundred different medical topics developed for primary care providers on Mayo Clinic Talks podcasts. Find them at ce.mayo.edu or your favorite podcasting app. If you've enjoyed Mayo Clinic Talks podcasts, please follow us. We're honored to have you as a listener and invite you to tune in again next week. Stay well.